you very much, Stephen, and the city of Ongtao for giving me the time. So we are all set, and again, a great pleasure to be here, knowing that there are many young professionals who are attending today, and young professionals are the future of our cities. In fact, we at UNICITI also have a large network of young professionals across the country, because the countries and the world, because we believe that this is where change is going to happen. So great, thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I will talk about low carbon thriving cities of tomorrow, and highlight maybe a few ideas that you may have come across, but which we feel the international agenda hasn't yet placed at the right importance level for us to achieve low carbon cities. To give you an idea of where our experience is coming from, so we at UNICITI have, as of now, worked with about 40 countries at the national level. We started working at the national level before we started working with cities in 2010, and we covered about 30 cities now across Asia and a little bit Africa and other places in the global south. At UNICITI, we stand for uniqueness in cities. This is what our name means. And we also have a large experience of climate change, both climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. And so while working with different United Nations agencies, development banks, such as Asian Development Bank, we could really see that looking in depth into the local context of each city allows it to strongly adapt to climate change, to strongly reduce carbon emissions, but also have a number of very valuable co-benefits, such as strong local identity, which attracts tourism, which attracts socioeconomic opportunities, which connects people to the city. So these are the points that I would like to develop a little bit today. Starting with an important news, you may have seen it. About 10 days ago, the International Panel on Climate Change has released a synthesis report where scientists identified that today the temperature has already increased by 1.1 degree compared to the pre-industrial levels. You may also know that the Paris Agreement, which is the biggest agreement the countries worldwide, or pretty much most of the countries, have signed, aims at keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. And in fact, scientists have also assessed in detail that we should really actually aim at 1.5 degrees because there is a big change in terms of biodiversity loss, natural catastrophes, if we miss those additional 0.5 degrees. Why I'm saying this is because with 1.1 today, we only can increase by 0.4 in the 80 years to come, which means that, in other terms, if we don't cap emissions today, then we are running into really all the catastrophic scenarios that I'm sure you're catching up on social media, on news, etc. So we are standing at a very crucial point where we need to reduce our emissions drastically and very promptly. Now, where do we stand in terms of emissions? So in 2021, the world has emitted 37 gigatons of CO2. And believe it or not, the buildings and the construction sector is nearly 40% of it. It's more than 1/3 of all these emissions. So this really places us, when we talk about low carbon city, at the center of meeting the Paris Agreement. It depends on us, on our sector, to a large extent, to achieve it. And now going a little bit deeper, if you look at just the manufacturing of conventional building materials, so what are these materials? Typically, they are concrete, they are cement, they are glass, they are aluminum. So these materials alone represent over 10%, 11% to be exact, of global CO2 emissions. Now, where I'm heading at, and I'm going to highlight it later, is when we talk about low carbon cities, often we want to talk about operational energy in buildings. Essentially, we look at energy efficient appliances, at capturing the inside indoor temperature so that there is less contact with the outdoor and we use less air conditioning. So all these things are important, but they're not sufficient, because until we continue building cities the way we build them today, we are really not up for reaching the international targets. Going a little bit further now and seeing how do we stand in terms of emissions regionally. So this graph, we have taken the graph pre-COVID, because during COVID, there have been irregular emission patterns, we can say, for a couple of years. So if you look at 2018, here in red, we see the countries that grow the fastest in terms of the emissions. And of course, we can see that Asia is, though it's not the main contributor to world emissions as yet, it is clearly going there. And now if we look at Southeast Asia specifically, so here what we see is that Indonesia and Vietnam are the countries whose emissions are growing the fastest. So some conclusions to take here in terms of how action is important. Going a little bit further into that, so Asia as of now is about 1/4 of global emissions, but as we said, growing very fast. Now Southeast Asia is about 8%, because of course India and China are the biggest contributions, with Russia, if we associate it to Asia, which Russia is both usually Asia and Europe as it is looked at. And importantly now for our purpose, since we have a focus on Vietnam today, we can see that Vietnamese emissions over the recent years have really grown tremendously fast and have become the fastest per capita, per person, in the entire Southeast Asian region. So see how sharp is the graph. So there is a little bit of a decrease during the COVID time, but that's a world trend. It is not related to specific efforts of Vietnam in that specific case. So that means that Vietnam really has an important role to play today in contributing to meeting the international low carbon targets. In fact, Vietnam has already undertaken a number of strong pledges, such as the National Climate Change Strategy to 2050, where at the recent COP, it pledged to become net zero by 2050. And here it is very important now to downscale this big strategic target to sectoral targets so that the strategic target can be met. And specifically coming to cities, cities are growing fast in Vietnam, as they grow fast in most Asian countries today. And so here an important data set that you may have seen already on our UNICITI pages or elsewhere, which is quite revealing. So while cities cover only 2% of the world's territory, they are responsible for 70% of global CO2 emissions. So for Vietnam to meet its strategic net zero target by 2050, it's very clear that cities are going to play a critical role in this objective. And now coming to really one of our favorite topics at UNICITI, because we really consider it critical for us to reach those targets. So as I said, very often we focus on operational energy. But now let us look, when we talk about the building life cycle, how many opportunities are there for emissions to happen? So this starts with extracting raw materials to make the building materials. It goes to manufacturing them. So you transport them to the factory, you manufacture them, then you transport them to the site. Every step of this graph has its own emissions. Construction, then while the building is in place, operational emissions are happening. But this is only one step out of many. And very often when we talk about low carbon cities, we focus only on this one, which is fundamentally wrong, because if we leave all those steps aside, then we are not meeting our Paris Agreement. So demolition also is very heavy in carbon emissions, disposing of the waste materials and landfill as well. So when we want to talk about low carbon cities, we want actually to address every of these steps. And so now, coming to why UNICITI has this mission of making cities unique. Because when we have this, what we call at UNICITI, one-size-fits-all approach to cities, essentially we build with same building materials, which, as we already discussed, are very heavy in carbon emissions. We build with standardized urban design, and we get a standardized landscape. So we contribute to emissions, but also we lose on those socioeconomic opportunities where people visit the place because this place is exciting, this place is unique, this place is a thrilling experience. So we are losing on all the fronts. Now, if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, so here on the other hand, we have a very interesting project which we came across, which is made in Vietnam itself, in a suburb of Hanoi, by H&P Architects, who actually reused 20,000 tiles from old roofs and reintroduced brick to create a unique design, but also to lower carbon emissions because they have reused materials that were already there. Create a passive design pattern where there is natural cooling happening, where there is more shading, so less use of AC is needed. And it also stands out and it creates local character. So we start seeing how local character, uniqueness, visual uniqueness of a city, and low carbon get connected. So I'll quickly walk you through 3 levels of a low carbon city, which is a building level, neighborhood level, and municipal national level. So what is it that we can do at a higher level to support the first 2 levels? The building level. So here, as I already started talking about building materials, this is really a critical step. We think that without concrete, we can't go anywhere. But until, the 60s, in the 20th century, many buildings were built without concrete. I mean, over the 20th century, it kept increasing. Now we are completely dependent on it. It wasn't like this before. It doesn't have to be like this all the time. And in fact, if you look at bamboo, which is extensively growing in most of the global south, bamboo has tremendous potential. You may have heard that countries like Canada and the US are now actively introducing timber in construction and introducing it into the building codes because there have been many tests showing that it is safe. I'll touch upon it just in a minute. Bamboo actually grows much faster than most of hardwood you find in Western countries. So this is one potential to activate. When we look into the belt where bamboo grows sustainably meaning that if you take some of it out for construction, you can easily replenish it. You are not deforesting the area, but you are constantly replenishing the stock. And we can see that Vietnam and most of Asia falls under that category. More to that, Vietnam produces 80% of the world's bamboo timber, which shows that Vietnam has a tremendous opportunity to introduce an alternative building material, which is much low in carbon, and which would create much more character for the cities. Now, how do we do that? Because, of course, just with soft bamboo, we can't build higher than maybe 1, maximum 2 stories high. Even 2 stories high, you need techniques. And we do need dense environments in cities. We all agree on that. In Asia, people are moving to cities. People who are already in cities still lack housing. So this is needed. And this is where we come across cross-laminated timber technique or glue balm. We can also do the same things with the bamboo. So this is a technique which consolidates timber in such a way that you can build very high-rise. So in fact, to show you, in Japan, now a design has been prepared and I believe the construction has started of a 70 stories high wooden building with 90% of local timber. So if we project ourselves, if we have a vision of the cities of the future, we need to see much beyond conventional small savings of energy here and there, and just really open our minds to dreaming, to seeing what are the opportunities we haven't tapped into and where we can put our effort to really create change at scale. And in fact, there is a lot of concern about fire and building with timber being unsafe. So a few years ago, I came across Michael Green in one of the events at which I was speaking in India. And Michael Green is one of the most famous architects building with timber located in Canada. So he shared with me these facts, and I was quite surprised at that time. But essentially, what he told me is that when a building catches a fire, if it's a wooden building, after 30 minutes, 25% of the strength of the timber piece is lost. So essentially you get it like this. Now, if you have a conventional building with the beams, the steel beams, so these ones under high temperature, they lose their strength. And so after 30 minutes, 90% of strength is lost. So for you to evacuate, it becomes actually much harder than if you build with timber. It's a little counterintuitive, but there's a lot of research done today which really shows the opportunities here. And last point about timber, of course, valid for bamboo. Timber is carbon negative because you know that trees absorb CO2, right? So as long as you use this tree for construction, this CO2 remains trapped in the tree and does not go into the atmosphere. So here again, one opportunity. And finally, how is it to live with timber? Because more and more now today, especially after COVID times, we talk about quality of life. We no longer are ready to just live in a house which doesn't inspire us, which doesn't open up our minds. So living in timber is a completely different experience here again. Finally, there has been research by the International Energy Agencies saying that between today and 2050, we are likely to use 3 times more air conditioning in buildings because of the global warming and heat island effect and all the wrong things we are doing in building cities. So here, to counter this, we have to introduce passive design. Not only rely on, again, operational energy, not only building materials that we already discussed, but how can we make the building in such a way that it creates natural cooling as much as possible. So you can see this design here, for example, there is still lighting, but there is shading so that the heat does not become as high as without these passive techniques it would have happened. So some studies say that up to 90% of operational energy can be saved if we actually introduce these passive techniques. Looking at the neighborhood level, here I just have one story to tell you, which is the story of a neighborhood of Doha, which is the capital of Qatar in the Middle East. So this neighborhood that you see was almost entirely built anew. Just a couple of years ago, this project just recently ended. And before this project, the country did a 3-year-long research on what would be today's architectural language. This means that we don't copy what was done in the past, and we also don't use the uniform language and design which everyone is using with uniform high rises. What can we do differently? So this research led to quite interesting guidelines on the architectural form. But in addition to this, the entire neighborhood harnessed the potential of the local context. So because it's on the seaside, they analyzed how the ocean breeze was most often moving, and they created streets which would absorb this ocean breeze to have more thermal comfort. Same, they would look at the sound path and optimize it in such a way that there is lighting, but also there is less heat. And then you can see also narrow streets which create natural shadings by the facades. So I've been to this place several times, and I can tell you this country is very hot. And when you step inside, you have clearly a few degrees less than anywhere else. So whereas in those areas, you wouldn't be outside at a certain time of the day, at the same time of the day, you would still be comfortable using public places in here. So as much you can achieve with passive design. And finally, looking at municipal and national levels. So these levels are very important because of course, when you are going to be part of the competition and doing design, you will look mostly at the building and neighborhood level. But cities and their governments, their national governments, need to play an active role in promoting those principles which can most benefit them. For example, look at this picture, which is becoming more and more common in Asia now, because when we look at the lifespan of buildings, there was a study we looked at UNICITI a couple of years ago, and it said that the life cycle of a building has dropped by 50% over the recent years. Because, we don't build to last for generations anymore, like we used to do until, say, early 20th century. We build because we need housing now, and then we don't hesitate demolishing. This is a tremendous carbon impact, but it's also an experience which is quite traumatic. I'm sure you see it in Vietnamese cities, I see it in cities I visit across Asia. You constantly have some construction, some demolition, some construction, some demolition. So your mind is not at peace. You are not just wandering in streets and admiring facades. There is constantly some noise, some dust. So, of course, we need to build, but we also need to limit where we can limit. For example, reuse existing buildings, even if they haven't built in the best philosophy we would wish to, but when we maintain and prolong the life cycle of a building, we also save on resources, on emissions, etc. And there are interesting projects. I will not delve into it today for the sake of time, but there are interesting projects which actually repurpose buildings in quite an interesting way. Just one project that I want to share, which was done in one of the Chinese cities, which I believe is under construction now today as well, which is essentially a kind of a flexible bamboo city. So here the principle is that you build in such a way that you can always adjust and add additional floors or create additional public places depending on how many people live there. So that kind of leaves room for growth for the city going forward. There are very few projects such as this one as of now, but again, it opens up our minds. Instead of thinking of this constant construction demolition cycle, how do we go out of it and create something much more sustainable, but also fitting our needs? So essentially, and my last point here today, I can't even recall which city it is, but it's a pretty usual panorama we see in most Asian cities being built. And here, governments often don't provide what we call form-based codes or neighborhood guidelines, as it is called in Singapore, where the developers know that there is a certain style that is desirable, which is combined by the language of the city, the identity of the city, the local context, the sustainability necessity. So we just come up with constructions such as this. But then, on the contrary, they're heritage buildings, because it's still quite hard to find examples of that local context tailored construction at scale. There are some cities such as Singapore, which is quite a great example actually, but not many in Asia as yet. But we can see that each experience is something unique, to which people get attached and to which visitors also come. And so when we talk about Vung Tau being a tourist city, it's very interesting to see how we can create this identity, which is low carbon and which also appeals to citizens and visitors. So with my last slide, I would like to show a process that we developed at UNICITI recently for the Asian Development Bank, on how to make low carbon cities. So essentially, the process comes to assessing the carbon footprint of a city. There are several methodologies, and we've narrowed down to one which is most effective and fastest as well, and can work with relatively limited data, where we know where we stand, how much we emit at city level as per different sectors. So that allows us to then identify most impactful sectoral and regulatory interventions, so that the city knows where carbon emissions reduction lies. And we at UNICITI always combine it with creating that unique identity, strengthening it, highlighting it. The third step is very important, is financing those interventions, because unless we finance them, they will not see the day. And you may have heard that there are many climate finance opportunities today by different institutions. So we look into how we secure funding in addition to national funding for those projects. And then finally, when you do this, you usually get quite a unique city panorama, unique city places, neighborhoods. And so this is where city branding can come very strongly, and city storytelling to really boost cities' socioeconomic opportunities tremendously. And I really believe that that kind of an approach would make Vietnamese cities stand out even more than they are today, because they're quite popular for tourism already. But that could create even very strong additional opportunities. So thank you very much for your attention. And it was really great to speak in front of you today.